Let me take you back to a day when the desert sands of Carrhae were not just silent witnesses, but thirsty for the fate of empires. Picture this: the sun rising over the endless horizon, shimmering on a sea of sand and dust. In the distance, you see 7 proud Roman legions, tens of thousands of soldiers, all marching with the confidence of conquerors. At their head rides Marcus Licinius Crassus, known across the world as the richest man in Rome and perhaps the most ambitious. But that day, those ancient sands would drink deeply, not of water, but of Roman blood. Out of the 40,000 who set out, only a broken few would ever return home. It is one of those stories where you can almost feel the tension in the air, the sense of something huge about to happen. How did it come to this? How did the mighty Republic, the same Rome that swept across continents, toppling kings and cities, find itself lost and broken, outsmarted by a people many in Rome barely understood? The answer lies not only in armies and tactics, but in human dreams and flaws. It is a story about pride, about wanting to make a mark on history, and about what happens when you ignore the wisdom of others. As we begin this journey into the heart of the Battle of Carrhae, let yourself imagine the world as it was, the clash between East and West, between old traditions and new ambitions. You might be surprised to learn that the Romans, for all their discipline and armor, were facing opponents whose way of fighting was almost completely alien to them. The Parthians rode swift horses and fired arrows with astonishing skill, turning the open desert into their greatest ally. Before we dive deeper into this epic tale of hope and disaster, take a moment to join our community. Like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the most fascinating moments of history. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come not from victory, but from defeat. And at Carrhae, history left us with questions that echo across the centuries. Picture Rome in 53 before Christ, not the mighty empire we often imagine, but a republic struggling with its own contradictions. The city ruled half the known world, yet at its heart, 3 men held the real power in an arrangement that was as fragile as morning frost. They called it the First Triumvirate, though it was never officially recognized by the Senate. Julius Caesar commanded respect through his brilliant military campaigns in Gaul. Pompey the Great had earned his nickname through decades of victories across the Mediterranean. And then there was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose wealth was so vast that modern billionaires would seem modest by comparison. But here's the fascinating thing about Crassus. Despite owning what some historians estimate was worth over 200 million denarii, imagine controlling a significant portion of a nation's entire economy, he felt overshadowed by his partners. Caesar had his conquests in Gaul, where he'd made himself a household name with each victory bulletin sent back to Rome. Pompey had already earned the title Magnus and commanded the kind of military reputation that opened doors and silenced rooms. Crassus had money, certainly, but in Roman culture, wealth without military glory was like a beautiful statue without a soul. The Romans respected riches, but they worshipped conquest. Every morning when Crassus walked through the forum, he knew that people whispered not about his tactical brilliance or heroic campaigns, but about his business deals and property investments. This wasn't just vanity, it was political survival. In Rome, military success translated directly into political influence, and political influence was the only way to protect the enormous fortune he'd built. Crassus understood that without the kind of legendary victories his partners enjoyed, his position in the triumvirate would eventually become untenable. So when he looked eastward toward Parthia, Crassus saw more than just another wealthy kingdom to plunder. He saw his path to immortality, his chance to stand equal with Caesar and Pompey in the pantheon of Roman heroes. The Parthian Empire, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus River, seemed like the perfect target, wealthy enough to fund future campaigns, distant enough that few Romans truly understood its military capabilities, and unconquered enough to offer the kind of glory that would echo through history. But there were warning signs that Crassus chose to ignore, and this is where the story becomes truly tragic. The Roman Senate, that ancient body of advisors and former magistrates, had serious reservations about this eastern adventure. They understood something that Crassus, in his hunger for glory, had overlooked. Parthia wasn't Gaul or Spain. This was an empire that had existed for over 2 centuries, with its own sophisticated military traditions and a deep understanding of desert warfare. The senators reminded Crassus of basic diplomatic protocol. Rome had no formal grievance with Parthia. There had been no border incidents, no attacks on Roman merchants, no insults to Roman dignity that would justify a full-scale invasion. This would be, in essence, a war of choice, driven by one man's ambition rather than Roman interests. Even more telling was the response from Rome's allies in the region. King Artavasdes of Armenia, a ruler who knew the Parthians intimately and understood the deadly efficiency of their military machine, offered what should have been welcome assistance. His proposal was strategically sound. Instead of marching directly across the Mesopotamian desert, Roman forces could move through Armenian territory, using the mountains and established supply lines to approach Parthia from the north. This route would have offered numerous advantages: better terrain for Roman infantry, established supply lines, local knowledge of Parthian tactics, and the support of Armenian forces who knew how to fight the Eastern style of warfare. It was the kind of careful, methodical approach that had made Rome master of the Mediterranean. But Crassus, perhaps fearing that sharing glory with Armenian allies would diminish his own achievement, declined this offer with what witnesses described as barely concealed contempt. In his mind, accepting help would make his eventual victory less impressive, less definitively Roman, less personally glorious. Instead, he chose the direct route, a march straight across the Mesopotamian desert toward the heart of Parthian territory. It was a decision that combined maximum risk with maximum potential glory, the kind of bold stroke that would either make him the equal of Alexander the Great or lead to complete disaster. Looking back, we can see how this choice revealed everything about Crassus's character and the fatal flaw that would doom his expedition. Here was a man so consumed with achieving individual glory that he was willing to ignore experienced advice, dismiss strategic wisdom, and gamble the lives of 40,000 Roman soldiers on his personal ambition. The desert he chose to cross wasn't just sand and heat. It was Parthian territory, where every water source, every village, every hill was known to his enemies and alien to his forces. He was leading his legions into a landscape that favored everything the Parthians did well and neutralized everything that made Roman armies superior. As Crassus's 7 legions marched eastward from their Syrian base, they were walking into what would become one of the most perfectly executed military disasters in ancient history. The man who had everything money could buy was about to discover that there were some things, tactical wisdom, respect for one's enemies, and the patience to listen to good advice, that no amount of gold could purchase. The road to Carrhae was paved not just with Roman ambition, but with a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were about to face. And waiting in the desert, the Parthian general Surena was already preparing to teach Rome a lesson it would never forget. To truly understand what happened at Carrhae, we need to look at the 2 men whose decisions would shape one of history's most decisive battles. On one side, we have Marcus Licinius Crassus, and here's where the story becomes almost tragically ironic. Crassus was already in his early 60s when he embarked on this campaign, an age when most Roman generals were content to enjoy their retirement in comfortable villas. But age wasn't his real disadvantage. It was experience, or rather, the lack of it in the kind of warfare he was about to face. Now, this might surprise you, but Crassus wasn't completely inexperienced in military matters. He had actually played a crucial role in defeating the Great Slave Rebellion led by Spartacus nearly 20 years earlier. But here's the fascinating difference. That campaign was fought in Italy, against an enemy that used Roman tactics, on terrain that Roman soldiers understood instinctively. Crassus had essentially been fighting Romans who happened to be rebelling. The same weapons, the same formations, the same strategic thinking he'd grown up with. What made Crassus truly formidable wasn't his sword arm, but his mind for business and logistics. He understood supply lines, he knew how to finance campaigns, and he had an almost supernatural ability to organize resources. In many ways, he was the perfect example of how Rome had evolved, from a city of warrior farmers to an empire run by sophisticated administrators who happened to wear military uniforms. But there's something deeply human about Crassus that makes his story so compelling. Imagine being the third wheel in history's most famous power trio. Every conversation, every public appearance, every decision had to account for the fact that his two partners had achieved the kind of legendary status that Romans would talk about for centuries. Caesar was already being compared to Alexander the Great. Pompey's nickname, Magnus the Great, wasn't just flattery. It was recognition of genuine military genius. Crassus, meanwhile, was known for his wealth and his business acumen. Romans respected these qualities, certainly, but they didn't inspire the kind of awe that military conquest created. In a culture that valued battlefield glory above almost everything else, being known primarily as a financier was like being the smartest person in a room full of athletes, respected but not revered. This personal dynamic explains so much about what was to come. Crassus wasn't just seeking military victory. He was seeking validation, the kind of recognition that would finally place him on equal footing with his partners. It's a very human motivation, and one that makes his ultimate fate all the more poignant. Now, across the desert, preparing to face this Roman expedition, was a man who represented everything Crassus was not. General Surena, and even his name tells us something fascinating about Parthian culture. Surena wasn't actually his personal name, but rather a hereditary title, like a family position passed down through generations. His real name has been lost to history, but his title meant something like Supreme Commander, or the one who leads in battle. Where Crassus was a businessman wearing a general's cloak, Surena was warfare personified. He came from a noble Parthian family that had been perfecting the art of mounted combat for generations. While Roman children learned rhetoric and mathematics, Parthian nobles like Surena learned to shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, to coordinate complex cavalry maneuvers, and to think in terms of mobility and deception rather than the straightforward confrontation that Romans preferred. Here's what makes Surena truly remarkable. He was probably younger than 30 when he faced Crassus. Yet he commanded not through inherited authority, but through proven ability. The Parthian system was different from Rome's. Military leadership was earned through demonstration of skill, not political connections or wealth. Surena had already proven himself in previous campaigns, earning the trust of soldiers who knew that following his orders usually meant coming home alive. But perhaps the most crucial difference between these two commanders was how they understood their enemy. Crassus, despite his intelligence and business acumen, seems to have approached Parthia with the same mindset he'd used against Spartacus. Find the enemy, engage them directly, use Roman discipline and equipment to overwhelm them. It was a straightforward approach that had worked for Rome countless times before. Surena, on the other hand, had been studying Roman military methods for years. He understood their strengths, the incredible discipline of the legions, their superior armor and weapons, their ability to maintain formation under pressure. But he also recognized their limitations, particularly in terrain that didn't favor infantry combat. Where Crassus saw his legions as an unstoppable force, Surena saw a powerful but inflexible weapon that could be neutralized through careful planning. The Parthian general also possessed something that Crassus lacked: intimate knowledge of the battlefield. The desert wasn't an obstacle to Surena. It was an ally. He knew every water source, every ridge that could hide cavalry, every stretch of open ground where his archers could operate most effectively. For him, the approaching Roman army wasn't just an invading force. It was an opportunity to demonstrate Parthian military superiority in the most dramatic way possible. There's also an interesting cultural dimension to consider. Romans thought of warfare as a test of national character. Courage, discipline, and determination would ultimately triumph over any tactical disadvantage. It was a philosophy that had served them well in most of their previous conquests, where enemies often broke under the psychological pressure of facing Roman legions. But Parthians had a completely different military philosophy. They saw warfare as an art form, something that required creativity, adaptability, and careful planning. Where Romans sought decisive battle, Parthians preferred to wear down their enemies through mobility and superior positioning. It wasn't cowardly, it was sophisticated, like the difference between a boxer who relies on power and one who wins through technique and strategy. As these two very different men prepared to face each other across the Mesopotamian desert, neither could fully understand what the other represented. Crassus saw in Surena just another barbarian general who would crumble before Roman might. Surena saw in Crassus an opportunity to prove that Roman military supremacy was more myth than reality. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the strengths and weaknesses of two armies, but the fundamental differences between two entirely different ways of thinking about power, warfare, and leadership. In the end, the desert would judge which approach was truly superior. The morning of the battle dawned with deceptive calm. Roman soldiers, accustomed to the cool mists of Italian dawns, found themselves squinting against a sun that seemed unusually harsh, even for the desert. What they didn't realize was that Surena had chosen this moment deliberately. The Romans would be fighting with the sun in their eyes, while his own forces moved with the light at their backs. Picture the Roman formation as it approached what they thought would be a straightforward engagement. 7 legions arranged in the classic manipular system that had conquered most of the known world. Heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, support troops protecting the flanks. It was a formation designed for the kind of head-to-head combat that Romans excelled at, where discipline and superior equipment would decide the outcome. But as the morning progressed, something began to feel wrong. The Parthian army that appeared on the horizon didn't look like anything the Romans had encountered before. Instead of the dense formations of infantry they expected, they saw what appeared to be a relatively small force of mounted warriors, moving with an almost fluid coordination across the desert landscape. Here's where Surena's genius becomes apparent. He had divided his forces into 3 distinct elements, each with a specific role to play in what was essentially a complex piece of military choreography. The horse archers formed the largest group, roughly 9,000 mounted bowmen whose entire tactical purpose was mobility and harassment. Behind them, hidden until the crucial moment, waited 1,000 cataphracts, the heavily armored cavalry that would deliver the decisive blow. And supporting everything was a massive supply train of camels carrying additional arrows, ensuring that his archers would never run out of ammunition. The battle began almost casually. Parthian horse archers approached the Roman lines at what seemed like a respectful distance, loosing arrows in the traditional manner of mounted warriors. Roman soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, formed their testudo or tortoise formation, shields locked together above and around them, creating a moving fortress that had protected Roman infantry for generations. At first, this seemed to work. Arrows struck the interlocked shields and bounced harmlessly away. Roman officers, observing from their positions, probably felt a moment of confidence. This was exactly the kind of barbarian tactic they dealt with before. Impressive to watch, but ultimately ineffective against Roman discipline and equipment. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of eventually closing for hand-to-hand combat, as Romans expected all enemies to do, the Parthian archers simply wheeled away, reformed at a different angle, and began the process again, and again, and again. What the Romans were experiencing was something that no Mediterranean army had ever encountered on this scale, the famous Parthian shot. These weren't just mounted archers. They were artists of mounted warfare who could fire accurately while riding at full gallop, even while retreating. Their technique was so refined that they could maintain continuous pressure on the Roman formation without ever giving the legionaries a chance to close and use their superior close combat skills. Here's a detail that really brings home the sophistication of Surena's planning. Traditional mounted archers carried a limited number of arrows, maybe 30 or 40 in their quivers. Once those were exhausted, they would need to withdraw from combat to resupply. But Surena had solved this problem by positioning thousands of camels loaded with arrows just behind his main force. His archers could rotate back, resupply in minutes, and return to the attack with fresh ammunition. This meant that what Romans expected to be a brief harassment before the real battle began turned into hours of continuous arrow fire. The psychological effect was devastating. Roman soldiers, trained to advance and engage their enemies directly, found themselves trapped in defensive formations, unable to advance because of the constant rain of arrows, unable to retreat because that would break their formation and invite disaster. As the day wore on, the heat became another enemy. Roman armor, designed for the cooler climates of Europe and the Mediterranean, became almost unbearable under the desert sun. Soldiers were facing not just enemy arrows, but dehydration, exhaustion, and the gradual breakdown of their formation's cohesion as men began to collapse from heat and stress. It was probably around midday when Crassus made his first serious tactical error. Seeing his formation being slowly worn down by the continuous archery, he ordered his son Publius to take a cavalry force and drive off the Parthian horse archers. This seems like a reasonable decision, but it played directly into Surena's strategy. Publius led his cavalry charge with typical Roman courage, but what happened next demonstrated the full sophistication of Parthian tactics. The horse archers didn't stand and fight. They retreated, drawing the Roman cavalry away from the main formation and deeper into the desert. This wasn't cowardice. It was a carefully planned maneuver designed to isolate and destroy the Roman cavalry piecemeal. Once Publius and his men were far enough from the main Roman force, Surena unleashed his cataphracts. These weren't the relatively lightly armed horse archers that had been harassing the Romans all morning. Cataphracts were the medieval knights of the ancient world, heavily armored cavalry on armored horses, carrying long lances and trained for devastating shock charges. The destruction of Publius's cavalry was swift and complete. Isolated from the main Roman force, outnumbered, and facing an enemy type they had no experience fighting, the Roman horsemen were overwhelmed. Publius himself fell in the fighting, and his head was brought back to the main battlefield as a gruesome trophy. When Crassus saw his son's head displayed on a Parthian lance, something broke inside the old general. Witnesses described him as becoming almost catatonic with grief and shock. This wasn't just personal loss. It was the collapse of his entire strategic vision. The campaign that was supposed to bring him glory equal to Caesar and Pompey had instead cost him his son and heir. But the battle wasn't over. With the Roman cavalry destroyed, Surena could now deploy his cataphracts against the main infantry formation. Here's where the true horror of the Roman situation became clear. Their testudo formation, designed to protect against arrows, made them incredibly vulnerable to heavy cavalry charges. Locked together in their defensive shell, they couldn't maneuver to meet the cataphract attacks, couldn't spread out to avoid the impact, couldn't do anything except endure charge after charge from armored lancers. The Parthian battle plan was working with clockwork precision. While the cataphracts smashed into the Roman formations, the horse archers continued their harassment from every other angle. Roman soldiers found themselves caught between two completely different types of attack: the massive impact of heavy cavalry charges and the constant wearing effect of arrow fire from all directions. As evening approached, the Roman formation began to disintegrate. Exhausted soldiers started to break from their positions, some trying to surrender, others attempting to flee across the desert. But the Parthians had prepared for this too. Small cavalry units were positioned to intercept fleeing Romans, while the main force continued to methodically destroy what remained of the once mighty legions. By nightfall, the battlefield presented a scene that would haunt Roman military thinking for generations. Of the approximately 40,000 men who had marched into the desert that morning, nearly 20,000 lay dead on the sand. Another 10,000 had been captured and would spend the rest of their lives as slaves in Parthian territory. Only about 10,000 Romans managed to escape the immediate battlefield, and many of these would die in the desert during the chaotic retreat that followed. Crassus himself, the man who had dreamed of matching Caesar's conquests and Pompey's glory, found himself commanding not a triumphant army, but a broken remnant fleeing through hostile territory. The richest man in Rome had gambled everything on this campaign, and in a single day had lost not just his army and his son, but his reputation and his future. The Battle of Carrhae was over, but its consequences were just beginning. In one day, Surena had demonstrated that Roman military supremacy was not inevitable, that careful planning and superior tactics could overcome even the most disciplined and well-equipped army in the world. The desert had indeed become Rome's graveyard, and the implications of this defeat would echo through history for centuries to come. What makes this battle so significant isn't just the scale of the Roman defeat, but what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare itself. The rigid formations and direct confrontation that had served Rome so well in the Mediterranean were suddenly obsolete when faced with an enemy that understood mobility, patience, and the deadly effectiveness of coordinated cavalry tactics. Was this defeat inevitable once Crassus chose to march into the desert? Or could different decisions have changed the outcome? These questions haunted Roman military thinkers for generations, and they continue to fascinate military historians today. What's certain is that the Battle of Carrhae marked the end of one era of Roman expansion and the beginning of a much more cautious approach to Eastern warfare. Was Crassus's greed his downfall, or was Rome doomed the moment it underestimated Parthia? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of empire. The sands of Carrhae had indeed drunk deeply that day, and the lessons written in Roman blood would influence military thinking for centuries to come. To truly understand what happened at Carrhae, we need to move beyond the grand strategies and tactical maneuvers and listen to the voices of the men who lived through this nightmare. While most personal accounts from ancient battles have been lost to time, historians have pieced together fragments from letters, later testimonies, and the writings of those who survived to tell their stories. Marcus Valerius, a centurion from the 10th Legion, somehow managed to survive both the battle and the terrible retreat that followed. Years later, when he was finally ransomed back to Roman territory, he spoke of that morning with a clarity that still haunts us today. He remembered how confident they had felt as they formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, how the familiar weight of his armor and the sound of his men checking their equipment had felt reassuring, almost routine. "We had done this 1,000 times before," he would later tell anyone who would listen. "Form the line, advance, engage the enemy, celebrate the victory. That was the Roman way. That was how we conquered the world." But as the sun rose higher and the Parthian arrows began to fall like deadly rain, Valerius realized they were facing something completely outside their experience. What strikes you most about these personal accounts is how quickly confidence turned to confusion, and confusion to desperation. Roman soldiers were trained to advance, to close with their enemies, to use their superior weapons and discipline to win decisive victories. But at Carrhae, every instinct they had developed through years of training worked against them. Gaius Antonius, a young soldier on his first major campaign, wrote a letter to his family during the brief lull before the final disaster. This letter, discovered centuries later in the ruins of a Syrian fort, provides one of our most intimate glimpses into the experience of ordinary soldiers. "The arrows never stop," he wrote. "We raise our shields, and they find the gaps. We lower them to see where to advance, and more arrows come. The sun beats down like a hammer, and our water is nearly gone." But Marcus still believes we will break through. He says Romans always find a way. That letter was never sent. Antonius fell during the cataphract charges later that afternoon, one of thousands of young Romans who would never see home again. But perhaps the most heartbreaking accounts come from the soldiers who witnessed the death of Publius Crassus, the general's son. These men had watched him grow up in the army, had seen him develop from an eager young officer into a competent cavalry commander. When he led that fateful charge against the Parthian horse archers, many of them knew it was a desperate gamble. But they followed anyway because that's what Roman soldiers did. Lucius Corvus, one of the few cavalry survivors, later described the moment when they realized they had been led into a trap. The horse archers just melted away before us, like mist before the wind. We thought we were winning. We thought we were showing them what Roman cavalry could do. And then the cataphracts appeared. What makes Corvus's account so powerful is how he describes the sheer shock of encountering something completely outside Roman military experience. These weren't just heavily armored cavalry. They were something that belonged more to mythology than warfare. Their horses looked like they were wearing scale armor, like some kind of metal beast, he remembered. And the riders, you couldn't see their faces, couldn't see anything human about them. Just metal and lances and the sound of hooves like thunder. The death of Publius wasn't just a tactical disaster, it was a deeply personal tragedy that affected every Roman on that battlefield. Soldiers who had served under his father for years watched as their general's world collapsed. Marcus Bruttidius, a veteran of 15 years, later wrote about seeing Crassus when his son's head was brought back to the Roman lines. The old man just stood there, staring at it like he couldn't understand what he was seeing. All those years of commanding men, all that wealth and power, and suddenly he was just a broken father looking at his dead son. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. For Roman soldiers, their commanders weren't just tactical leaders, they were father figures, symbols of Roman authority and competence. Seeing Crassus reduced to helpless grief shattered something fundamental in the minds of men who had always believed in Roman invincibility. As the battle continued and the Roman formation began to break down, individual accounts reveal the growing desperation of men who found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. Water became more precious than gold, a bitter irony for soldiers who had marched east seeking treasure. The desert heat, which had seemed merely uncomfortable that morning, became a torment that rivaled the Parthian arrows. Sextus Calvus, a standard-bearer who somehow survived the initial battle only to die during the retreat, left behind a testimony that reveals the growing awareness among Roman soldiers that they were facing something unprecedented. "We kept waiting for them to fight like men," he said, "to come close enough that we could use our swords, show them what Roman steel could do. But they fought like spirits of the desert, appearing and disappearing, striking and vanishing. It was like fighting the wind itself." The retreat that followed the battle reveals perhaps the most tragic dimension of the human cost. Thousands of wounded Romans, abandoned by their fleeing comrades, faced the choice between death from their injuries or capture by an enemy they barely understood. Some chose to end their own lives rather than face slavery in an unknown land. Others, too wounded to move, simply waited for the desert heat or Parthian soldiers to finish what the battle had started. Those who were captured faced a fate that Romans considered worse than death: slavery in a foreign land where they would never see home again. Marcus Caecilius, who was eventually ransomed after 12 years in Parthian territory, described the strange mixture of respect and contempt with which their captors treated them. "They called us brave, but foolish," he remembered. "They couldn't understand why we had marched so far to die in their desert. One of their officers told me that Romans fought like wild boars, dangerous when cornered but too stupid to avoid the trap in the first place." Perhaps the most haunting detail from these personal accounts is how many Roman soldiers, even in defeat, maintained their faith in Rome itself. They blamed Crassus for his poor leadership, cursed the desert and the heat, and mourned their fallen comrades. But they never stopped believing that Rome would eventually avenge their defeat. "The eagles will return," was a common phrase among the survivors, referring to the legion standards that had been captured by the Parthians. Rome never forgets. Rome never forgives. This faith would prove to be both accurate and tragically incomplete. Rome did eventually reclaim some of the captured standards, but it took decades, and the cost in Roman lives continued to mount with each subsequent campaign in the East. The human dimension of Carrhae reminds us that behind every great historical event are individual stories of courage, fear, hope, and loss. These weren't just numbers in a military report. They were brothers and sons, fathers and friends, Men who had left their farms and shops to serve an empire that promised them glory but delivered them to an unmarked grave in a foreign desert. Their voices, echoing across 2 millennia, remind us that the true cost of ambition is always measured not in gold or territory, but in the irreplaceable lives of those who pay the price for their leaders' dreams. The desert may have claimed their bodies, but their stories continue to speak to us about the eternal human experience of war, loss, and the terrible price of miscalculation on the grand stage of history. The death of Marcus Licinius Crassus didn't happen on the battlefield at Carrhae. That would come later, in a moment that perfectly encapsulated the tragic irony of his entire Eastern adventure. After the devastating defeat, Crassus found himself trapped with the remnants of his army, desperately trying to negotiate some kind of escape from an impossible situation. Picture this scene. The richest man in Rome, who had once owned entire city blocks and controlled vast commercial networks across the Mediterranean, now reduced to hiding in the ruins of Carrhae with barely 10,000 survivors from his once mighty army. The man who had dreamed of matching Caesar's conquests in Gaul was now begging for his life from enemies he had gravely underestimated. Surena, the Parthian general who had orchestrated this masterpiece of military strategy, agreed to meet with Crassus under a flag of truce. But here's where the story takes on an almost mythological quality. Ancient sources tell us that during these negotiations, tensions escalated rapidly. Some accounts suggest that Crassus was attempting to mount a horse provided by the Parthians when the situation turned violent. Others claim that Surena had planned treachery from the beginning. What we know for certain is that Crassus died during these negotiations, along with most of his remaining officers, but the manner of his death became the stuff of legend, and it reveals something profound about how the ancient world viewed poetic justice. According to later Roman historians, the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat after killing him, mocking his legendary greed with a final, terrible irony. Whether this actually happened or became part of the story later, it captured something essential about how people understood the connection between Crassus's character and his fate. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The man who had never had enough gold finally received all he could ever consume. It was the kind of detail that ancient writers loved because it suggested that the gods themselves had a sense of justice, that hubris would inevitably be punished in ways that perfectly matched the crime. But the real tragedy wasn't just Crassus's personal fate. It was what his death meant for Rome itself. To understand this, we need to step back and look at how the First Triumvirate had actually worked. It wasn't just an alliance of convenience between 3 powerful men. It was a delicate balance that had kept the Roman Republic from tearing itself apart. Think of it like a 3-legged stool. Caesar brought military genius and popular support, especially among the common soldiers and the urban masses. Pompey contributed his legendary reputation and his connections with the Senate's more traditional elements. Crassus provided the financial resources that made everything else possible: the money to fund campaigns, to buy political support, to maintain the vast networks of patronage that kept Roman politics functioning. With Crassus gone, this careful balance collapsed almost immediately. Caesar and Pompey had always been rivals beneath their public cooperation, but Crassus had served as a buffer between them, a third party whose interests forced them to compromise and negotiate. Without him, there was nothing to prevent their natural competition from escalating into open conflict. The political mathematics were suddenly very different. Where once there had been 3 centers of power that had to work together, now there were only 2. And Rome, as everyone understood, was not big enough for both Caesar and Pompey to reign supreme simultaneously. News of Carrhae reached Rome several weeks after the battle, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape across the desert. The city's reaction was complex and revealing. There was genuine grief for the thousands of Roman soldiers who had died, shock at the scale of the defeat, and anger at Crassus for leading the army into such an obvious trap. But there was also something else, a kind of nervous awareness that the political landscape had fundamentally changed. Senators who had grown comfortable with the predictable dynamics of the triumvirate suddenly found themselves facing an uncertain future. The wealth that Crassus had used to oil the wheels of Roman politics was gone. The mediating influence that had kept Caesar and Pompey from each other's throats had vanished. Caesar, who was in the middle of his Gallic campaigns when he learned of Crassus's death, understood the implications immediately. He had always been the most politically astute of the three triumvirs, and he could see that the death of their partnership's financial pillar left him in a precarious position. Pompey had better connections in Rome, more respect from the traditional aristocracy, and the advantage of being physically present in the city while Caesar was still fighting in distant Gaul. Pompey's reaction was more complex. Part of him may have felt genuine grief. He and Crassus had been allies for years, and their partnership had brought both of them enormous benefits. But Pompey was also a practical politician, and he must have realized that Crassus's death presented him with both opportunities and dangers. With the triumvirate's financier gone, Pompey would need to find new sources of support, new ways to maintain his political position. The Senate, meanwhile, saw Crassus's death as a potential opportunity to reassert their traditional authority. For years, they had been forced to work within the framework established by the triumvirate, accepting legislation and appointments that they would have preferred to block. With the triumvirate weakened, some senators began to hope that they could drive a wedge between Caesar and Pompey, using their rivalry to restore the Senate's traditional dominance over Roman politics. But here's where the story becomes truly tragic from a Roman perspective. The very factors that made Crassus's death seem like an opportunity for political renewal actually made civil war almost inevitable. Without the stabilizing influence of their shared partner, Caesar and Pompey began to view each other not as allies but as threats. Caesar faced a particular dilemma. His command in Gaul was scheduled to end, and Roman law required him to return to Rome as a private citizen before seeking higher office again. But as a private citizen, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies, who had been accumulating grievances against him for years. His only protection lay in maintaining his command or immediately transitioning to another high office, neither of which was possible without Pompey's support. Pompey, for his part, began to see Caesar's continued military success in Gaul as a growing threat to his own position as Rome's premier general. Every victory Caesar won, every tribe he conquered, every bit of treasure he sent back to Rome enhanced Caesar's reputation and made him a more dangerous rival. The partnership that had once benefited both men was becoming a zero-sum competition. The breakdown happened gradually, then suddenly. For several years after Carrhae, Caesar and Pompey maintained the fiction of their alliance, but the underlying tension grew steadily worse. Political compromises became harder to reach. Public statements grew more pointed. Supporters on both sides began to prepare for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. The final break came in 59 before Christ, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army and marched on Rome itself. But the seeds of that civil war were planted in the desert sands of Carrhae, in the moment when Crassus's death destroyed the delicate balance that had kept the Roman Republic functioning. What makes this tragedy so profound is that it was entirely avoidable. If Crassus had accepted the Armenian king's offer of a safer route, if he had listened to the Senate's warnings, if he had been content with his enormous wealth instead of craving military glory, any of these decisions might have prevented not just his own death, but the civil war that followed. Instead, his personal ambitions set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic itself. The triumvirate that had been created to preserve stability ended up precipitating the very chaos it was meant to prevent, and Rome, which had survived external enemies from Hannibal to Germanic tribes, would nearly tear itself apart in a series of civil wars that lasted for decades. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. Crassus had sought military glory to match his political partners, but his failure achieved something far more significant than any victory could have. It changed the course of Roman history. His death in the desert didn't just end one man's ambitions, it ended the Roman Republic as a functioning political system. In seeking to become the equal of Caesar and Pompey, Crassus had inadvertently ensured that one of them would eventually become emperor. The three-way balance that had preserved republican government was gone forever, replaced by the winner-take-all dynamic that would ultimately produce the Roman Empire. The sands of Carrhae had claimed more than 20,000 Roman lives. They had also buried the last hope for the survival of the Roman Republic as the founders had envisioned it. The shadow of Carrhae stretched across Roman consciousness for generations, becoming something far more than just another military defeat. It transformed into a cultural wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder that Roman power had limits that even Romans themselves hadn't fully understood. To grasp the true impact of this battle, you need to understand what those captured legion standards meant to the Roman psyche. The aquila, the golden eagle that topped each legion's primary standard, wasn't just a piece of military equipment. It was the spiritual heart of the unit, a sacred object that embodied the honor and identity of thousands of soldiers. Losing an aquila in battle was considered one of the most shameful disasters that could befall a Roman army. At Carrhae, the Parthians didn't just capture one or two eagles, they seized the standards of 7 entire legions. Imagine the psychological impact of this loss. In temples and meeting halls across the Roman world, people could see the empty spaces where these eagles should have been displayed. Every religious ceremony, every military parade, every public gathering served as a reminder of the defeat in the desert. But what made this loss even more haunting was how the Parthians chose to use their trophies. Rather than simply melting down the gold or storing the eagles as curiosities, they displayed them prominently in their temples and used them in their own religious ceremonies. Roman scouts and diplomats who traveled east brought back reports of seeing their sacred eagles being paraded in Parthian celebrations, a deliberate humiliation that kept the wound of Carrhae fresh in Roman memory. The psychological impact went far beyond symbolism. For the first time in generations, Romans had encountered an enemy that not only defeated them, but did so using tactics that seemed to make Roman military superiority irrelevant. The disciplined infantry formations that had conquered the Mediterranean suddenly appeared obsolete when faced with the mobility and coordination of Parthian cavalry. This realization forced a fundamental reassessment of Roman military doctrine. Generals who had grown up believing in the inevitable superiority of Roman arms found themselves studying reports of the battle, trying to understand how their most proven tactics had failed so completely. Military schools began teaching new courses on cavalry warfare and desert fighting. The Roman army that emerged from this period of reflection was more flexible, more aware of its limitations, and more respectful of non-Roman military traditions. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how Carrhae changed Roman attitudes toward Eastern expansion. Before the battle, many Romans had viewed the conquest of Parthia as inevitable, just another wealthy kingdom waiting to be absorbed into their growing empire. The disaster in the desert shattered this confidence, replacing it with a healthy respect for Parthian military capabilities that would influence Roman policy for centuries. The quest to recover the lost eagles became a recurring theme in Roman politics and military planning. Ambitious generals and emperors would periodically announce campaigns to restore Roman honor by reclaiming the captured standards. These expeditions became a kind of political theater, allowing leaders to demonstrate their commitment to Roman dignity while also providing opportunities for military glory. The most famous of these recovery missions came during the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. In 20 before Christ, through a combination of diplomacy and implied military threat, Augustus managed to secure the return of some of the Carrhae standards. The ceremony marking their restoration was one of the great propaganda victories of his reign, celebrated in art, literature, and public festivals across the empire. Yet even this diplomatic triumph revealed how deeply Carrhae had affected Roman thinking. The fact that Augustus chose negotiation rather than conquest to recover the eagles showed that even Rome's most successful leader understood the dangers of underestimating Parthian military capabilities. The desert that had claimed Crassus's army continued to serve as a cautionary reminder of the limits of Roman power. The battle also established a template for Roman-Parthian relations that would persist for centuries. Rather than seeking the complete conquest that had characterized Roman expansion in other directions, both empires gradually settled into a pattern of limited warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and territorial exchanges that acknowledged neither side's ability to completely dominate the other. This recognition of mutual limitations was actually quite remarkable in the context of ancient warfare. Most empires of this period continued expanding until they either conquered everything within reach or collapsed from overextension. The Roman-Parthian relationship, forged in the crucible of Carrhae, represented something different, a mature acknowledgement that even the mightiest powers must sometimes accept boundaries to their ambitions. The cultural impact extended far beyond military and political circles. Roman literature began to feature the battle as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition. Poets and historians used Crassus's fate as a moral lesson about the perils of greed and the importance of respecting one's enemies. The story became part of the standard curriculum in Roman schools, where young aristocrats learned about leadership by studying what not to do. Interestingly, the battle also had unexpected effects on Roman commercial and cultural development. The disaster at Carrhae forced Romans to develop new approaches to Eastern trade, leading to the establishment of more diplomatic commercial relationships with Parthian merchants. This economic cooperation, born from military necessity, actually enriched both empires and contributed to the cultural exchange that would characterize the region for centuries. The architectural legacy of Carrhae can still be seen today in the defensive structures that Romans built along their eastern frontier. Unlike the aggressive fortifications designed for expansion that characterized earlier periods, these later installations were clearly designed for defense and accommodation with a respected enemy. The very design of these forts acknowledged lessons learned in the desert, the need for mobility, the importance of cavalry, and the reality that Roman infantry alone could not guarantee victory in all circumstances. Perhaps most significantly, Carrhae marked the beginning of what historians call the Eastern Question in Roman strategic thinking. For the rest of the empire's existence, Roman leaders would be forced to maintain substantial military resources in the East, not for conquest, but simply to maintain the balance of power with Parthia and its successor, the Sassanid Empire. This permanent military commitment had enormous implications for Roman development. Resources that might have been used for expansion in other directions, for internal improvements, or for addressing social problems were instead devoted to maintaining the eastern frontier. Some historians argue that this drain on Roman resources, dating back to the lessons of Carrhae, contributed to the empire's eventual decline centuries later. The memory of the battle also influenced Roman diplomatic practices in surprising ways. The disaster taught Roman negotiators to approach Eastern kingdoms with greater respect and sophistication. The crude intimidation tactics that had worked against Germanic tribes or Gallic chieftains proved counterproductive when dealing with the sophisticated courts of Eastern empires. Roman diplomacy became more nuanced, more willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of non-Roman political systems. Even the Roman calendar bears traces of Carrhae's influence. The date of the battle became an unofficial day of mourning in the Roman military calendar, a time when commanders would remind their troops of the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of respecting their enemies. This tradition continued well into the imperial period, serving as an annual reminder of one of Rome's most instructive defeats. The battle's legacy extended beyond Rome's borders as well. Other enemies of Rome studied accounts of Surena's tactics, learning that the seemingly invincible Roman legions could be defeated through superior mobility, better use of terrain, and innovative tactical approaches. Germanic tribes, British chieftains, and African kingdoms all incorporated lessons from Carrhae into their own military planning. In the end, the Battle of Carrhae became something unique in ancient military history, a defeat that taught the victors as much as the vanquished. Rome learned humility, strategic patience, and the importance of understanding one's enemies. These lessons, bought with the lives of 20,000 legionaries, ultimately made Rome a more sophisticated and durable empire. The eagles that fell in the desert that day became symbols not just of Roman defeat, but of Roman growth. Their recovery decades later marked not a return to the old arrogance that had led Crassus into the trap, but the emergence of a more mature Roman approach to power and conquest. In losing those standards, Rome had found something perhaps more valuable: wisdom. The echoes of Carrhae still resonate today, reminding us that no power, no matter how mighty, is immune to the consequences of hubris, poor planning, and failure to understand the world beyond its borders. The desert that claimed Crassus's army continues to teach lessons about the limits of ambition and the price of underestimating one's enemies. You know, when I think about the Battle of Carrhae, I can't help but imagine what it must have felt like to be a Roman soldier in those final moments. Picture this. You're standing in formation, shield locked with your brothers, watching endless waves of arrows darken the sky above you. The desert sun beats down mercilessly, your water is running low, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the thunder of approaching cavalry. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment an entire worldview came crashing down. The thing that strikes me most about Carrhae is how it shattered Roman confidence in a way that went far deeper than just losing a battle. For generations, Roman legions had been unstoppable. They had conquered Gaul, crushed Germanic tribes, and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. The legion system wasn't just military doctrine. It was proof of Roman superiority, evidence that discipline and organization could overcome any obstacle. But Surena's victory revealed something Romans had never truly considered. Their legendary infantry tactics had a fatal weakness. In the open terrain of Mesopotamia, those tight formations that had worked so brilliantly in European forests and mountain passes became death traps. The Parthians didn't need to break Roman lines. They simply needed to stay out of reach and let their arrows do the work. What fascinates me is how this battle affected the Roman psyche for generations afterward. Roman historians would write about Carrhae with a mixture of horror and disbelief, as if they still couldn't quite process what had happened. Imagine being raised on stories of Roman invincibility, only to learn that an entire army, 7 full legions, had been wiped out by an enemy most Romans had barely heard of. The lost eagles became symbols of national shame. In Roman culture, losing your legion's eagle was considered the ultimate disgrace, worse than death itself. For decades afterward, Roman mothers would tell their sons about the eagles of Carrhae, still somewhere in Parthian hands, waiting to be reclaimed. It took nearly 30 years before Augustus finally negotiated their return through diplomacy rather than warfare, a telling sign of how deeply the defeat had shaken Roman confidence. But here's what really gets me about this story. Carrhae didn't just change Roman military thinking. It rewrote the entire political landscape of the ancient world. When news of Crassus's death reached Rome, it didn't just mean the loss of a general or even an army. It meant the end of the delicate balance that had kept the Roman Republic from tearing itself apart. The First Triumvirate had been like a 3-legged stool. Remove one leg, and the whole thing collapses. With Crassus gone, there was nothing to prevent Caesar and Pompey from their inevitable collision. In a very real sense, the Parthian arrows that found their mark at Carrhae also sealed the fate of the Roman Republic. The civil wars that followed would transform Rome from a republic into an empire, changing the course of Western civilization forever. I often wonder what would have happened if Crassus had listened to Artavasdes of Armenia. Here was an experienced king offering genuine strategic advice. Take the northern route, use Armenian territory as a base, avoid the desert entirely. But Crassus was so consumed with his own ambitions, so desperate to match the military achievements of his younger partners, that he dismissed this wisdom. There's something tragically human about this, isn't there? We've all known people who were so focused on proving themselves that they ignored good advice. Crassus had spent his entire life accumulating wealth and political influence, but when it came to actual warfare, he was completely out of his depth. His tragedy wasn't just personal. It was the tragedy of a man who confused success in one area with competence in another. Carrhae also marked the beginning of what would become one of Rome's longest-running strategic challenges: how to deal with the East. The Parthian Empire wasn't like the Celtic tribes or Germanic warriors Rome was used to fighting. This was a sophisticated civilization with its own military traditions, political structures, and strategic thinking. The Parthians understood something that would perplex Roman generals for centuries. You don't have to meet your enemy on his terms. Instead of trying to match Roman discipline with their own infantry, they played to their strengths: mobility, archery, and knowledge of the terrain. It was a lesson that later empires would learn when facing nomadic peoples. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in refusing to fight the kind of battle your enemy expects. Behind all the strategic analysis and political consequences, I never want to lose sight of the human tragedy of Carrhae. 20,000 Roman soldiers died in that desert, most of them young men from farms and villages across Italy. They had joined the legions seeking adventure, citizenship, or simply a way to feed their families. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of dust, arrows, and dying horses under a pitiless sun. The 10,000 who were captured and marched off to Parthian slavery faced a different kind of death: the slow erasure of identity and hope. Some of these men may have lived for decades in captivity, always remembering that terrible day when their world ended. Their stories remind us that behind every great historical event are countless individual tragedies that rarely make it into the history books. What strikes me most about the Battle of Carrhae is how relevant its lessons remain. Throughout history, we see the same pattern repeated: powerful civilizations becoming overconfident, underestimating their enemies, and paying terrible prices for their arrogance. The British in Afghanistan, the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan again. The details change, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Carrhae teaches us that military superiority is never permanent, that tactics that work in one environment may fail catastrophically in another, and that understanding your enemy is just as important as understanding yourself. Most importantly, it reminds us that individual decisions, like Crassus's choice to ignore Armenian advice, can have consequences that echo through centuries. The sands of Carrhae have long since covered the bones of those 20,000 Romans, but the lessons of that terrible day remain as relevant as ever. In our own time of global uncertainties and shifting power balances, perhaps we would do well to remember what happened when the richest man in Rome discovered that some things truly cannot be bought with gold. In the end, Carrhae stands as more than just a military disaster. It's a meditation on hubris, a study in unintended consequences, and a reminder that even the mightiest empires are built and maintained by fallible human beings who make very human mistakes. The desert remembers everything, and sometimes if we listen carefully, we can still hear the whispers of ancient wisdom carried on the wind. If this story of ambition and downfall moved you, like the video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, where history's greatest battles come to life.